Hi, everybody. My name is Ellen McNamara. Can you guys hear me okay? Is the audio good, Miguel and Caitlin?
I can hear you well, Ellen, so the audio
Okay,
seems to be working.
great. All right, thank you guys. My name is Ellen McNamara. I am a Spanish-English bilingual speech pathologist by trade. I'm also a PhD candidate in disability studies at UIC. I currently work in the Assistive Technology unit at UIC on the augmentative and alternative communication team. I'm really excited to be talking to you specifically about AT or assistive technology in the Latinx community. I'd like to thank the sponsors of this webinar as well as the others in this series, which is the Autism Program of Illinois. And these are our objectives for today's session. Following this webinar, you will be able to list two barriers or disparities experienced by Spanish-speaking children with ASD, autism spectrum disorders, or their families. You'll be able to discuss at least one technique or tool for providing culturally linguistically responsive services to Spanish-speaking children with autism and their families. And finally, you'll be able to describe one strategy within AAC service provision specifically that supports the unique communication needs of Spanish-speaking children with ASD and their families. So we're going to start out by spending a little bit of time setting the stage for our discussion today, giving you a little bit of background and clarifying specifically who and what we're talking about and why. This includes the Latinx community, communication, assistive technology, and augmentative alternative communication, or AAC. On this slide is an image with a colored map of Latin America spanning from Mexico in the north to Chile and Argentina in the south. To the left of the map are the words Latina, Latino, and Latinx listed vertically. This image is used to describe who we're talking about. The Latinx community is a heterogeneous group that includes anyone who comes from Latin America or anyone whose family has come from Latin America. This community consists of many different people from different countries with different values and languages. However, the most commonly or frequently spoken language throughout Latin America is Spanish. Other familiar terms for the Latinx community, as I listed in the image, are Latino and Latina, although Latinx is a gender neutral and inclusive term for this community. The image on this slide includes a green line drawing of an individual person. There are two speech bubbles, one arising from the person's head, which reads, "If you talk to a man in a language he understands, that goes to his head." The second speech bubble arises from the chest, stating, "If you talk to a man in his language, that goes to his heart." And this is a quote from Nelson Mandela. And although each member of the Latinx community is unique, is an individual, the community shares many common cultural beliefs and practices, as well as languages. As I mentioned, there are different languages that are spoken within this community, the most common of which is Spanish, but also includes many indigenous languages, English, Portuguese. But the purpose of this slide is to point out that language and culture are intricately tied and are embedded in all aspects of our lives, especially the practice of communication. But what is communication? Well, on this slide, there's a picture of a highway road with browning grass on either side. The highway has a white line down the middle separating the two lanes with two white arrows on the pavement pointing in opposite directions, representing the different directions of traffic. And this image represents the idea that communication is a two-way street. Similarly, the process of communication requires sending a message and receiving a message from another person, one to another, back and forth. In this way, communication is comprised of a series of complex and fluid interactions that include but are not limited to using and understanding facial expressions, body language and gestures, reading and writing, speaking and listening. Communication involves recognizing, processing, and making sense of the behaviors of others, and then responding in ways that represent our own ideas and intentions, yet also will be understood by our communication partners. The image on this slide represents a snapshot moment in communication, where one person, the silhouette on the left, is forming their idea or message in their mind, and then sharing it by speaking to a second person, the silhouette on the right, who hears or perceives these words and then processes them to make sense of them. The complex process of communication is one that we don't really think about very often, but it's embedded into most aspects of our daily life, including work, education, self-care, our healthcare, and our socialization and relationships. Communication is especially pertinent for people with autism spectrum disorders, or ASD. Communication impairments are an integral part of a ASD diagnosis. The image on this slide represents the current DSM diagnostic criteria for autism. So in addition to restrictive repetitive behaviors, a person must also present deficits in social communication and interaction in order to receive a diagnosis of autism. Specifically, these deficits in social and communication and interaction are characterized by deficits in social emotional reciprocity, deficits in nonverbal communication behaviors, and deficits in developing and maintaining relationships. So with this in mind, most everyone who has a diagnosis of ASD also has trouble with some aspect of communication, which is why this is important. Oops, sorry. So statistically speaking, it's estimated that about 1 in 59 people have a diagnosis of autism, and approximately a third of these are functionally nonverbal, which means that they have very limited speech. And if 1/3 of people with autism are functionally nonverbal, then about 2/3 are verbal. Many of these people with autism who are verbal experience difficulties in understanding, processing, and responding to messages received by others, as well as in formulating their own ideas and thoughts to share. Okay, so we reviewed who is in the Latinx community and a little bit about communication and autism. Let's move on to assistive technology, or AT. AT is a broad term that describes a variety of tools and strategies that facilitate facilitate a range of daily tasks for people with disabilities, ranging from wheelchairs to grab bars to hearing aids. In this way, AT is an umbrella term, which is why on your slide, there's a black and white line drawing of an umbrella with examples of AT underneath. Those examples under the umbrella is augmentative and alternative communication, or AAC, which are tools and strategies that support communication. On this slide, there's one definition of AAC from the American Speech, Language, and Hearing Association, which reads that AAC uses a variety of techniques and tools, including picture communication boards, line drawings, speech generating devices, tangible objects, manual signs, gestures, and fingerspelling to help individuals express thoughts, wants, and needs, feelings, and ideas. We all use different ways or forms to communicate with one another. The term AAC is typically used to describe tools and strategies uh, utilized by people who have communication impairments. People with communication impairments are also a heterogeneous group with varying medical diagnoses. So they can be people who are born with disabilities, who acquire disabilities later in life. They can be people whose disabilities or impairments are stable, meaning they don't really change, or they can be people whose abilities or conditions are degenerating over time. The point is that everyone who has communication impairments, whether they use AAC or not, are different and they're individuals, even if they do have the same medical diagnoses. So that being said, some people with communication impairments who use AAC may not have any speech, or they may have speech that's difficult to understand. Other people might have speech that fluctuates over time. This fluctuation could occur within a given day, over the course of a week, or over the course of a lifetime. Also on this slide, you have a quote that states, "Not being able to speak is not the same as not having anything to say." The next few slides give some background information about AAC specifically. I don't think we're going to spend a ton of time on it, but just briefly so you have an idea of what AAC is, for those of you who did not join us for a previous webinar where we reviewed this information in more detail. But AAC systems are typically classified into two categories, including unaided systems and aided systems. Unaided systems are body-based modes, so they're communication aside from speech that utilizes your body. You don't need any other aid to use these AAC systems. They include pointing, gestures, pantomime, facial expressions, and sign language. Aided systems are those that require tools or equipment in addition to the body. They can range from paper and pencil to communication boards, or some of the examples that we're going to see in the next few slides. Aided AAC systems, or those that require a tool or a piece of equipment, are further categorized based on the complexity of the technology. So they range from low tech to mid tech to high tech. Low tech systems typically don't require a power source, so they don't require batteries, or they don't need to be plugged in any way. Mid-tech systems may require a power source, but they're typically not computer-based, and they rely on recorded speech, so digitized speech. And high-tech systems require a power source, are computer-based, and include synthesized or computer-generated speech output. This slide has a few examples of low-tech aided AAC systems. So on the left, there's a man in a wheelchair looking at a middle-aged woman who is holding a communication board that's made of clear plastic with a hole the size of her face in the middle so that they can see each other. And then on the right, there's a blue plastic binder with pieces of Velcro arranged vertically on the front with 3 to 4 pictures, symbols with 1 to 2 words written on top of the Velcro line. Examples include oranges, ball, and bathroom. These are some examples of mid-tech AAC systems that require a power source but rely on recorded speech. The first example has 3 different message options represented by different colored circular buttons, as well as pictures with symbols on them. The second example in the middle is a white plastic communication device with a handle that has 15 buttons with pictures on them. And the third is a black plastic rectangular communication device with a handle on top and has 4 large options for messages. Okay. Oh, I'm sorry. I realized that I hadn't advanced the slides. That was probably why somebody was raising their hand. Okay, so I'm just going to quickly show those. Here's the example of here's a slide that discusses the low-tech, mid-tech, and high-tech systems. This slide shows the example pictures of low-tech AAC systems. This slide shows the example of mid-tech AAC systems. And now we should be caught up. I apologize. Finally, you have a few examples of high-tech AAC systems. These are those that require a power source, are computer-based, and offer synthesized or computer-generated speech. So the point of these 3 different examples are really the size. The blue device on your left is about the size of your average tablet or iPad, maybe 8 inches. The example in the middle is about the size of a cell phone. And the example on your right is a little bit larger, probably about 12 to 14 inches, so maybe the size of your average laptop screen. And the last point that I just want to make about AAC systems is that there are different ways messages are generated using AAC. For example, some people might spell to make their messages. Some might make messages using single words, 1 word at a time, to create an utterance, while other systems might have pre-stored phrases that are already put together. These messages can be represented in different ways. For those that spell, it's usually represented by letters in the formation of a keyboard or arranged alphabetically. They can be represented by words or phrases, photographs, line drawings, or a combination of both. Okay, so now that we've got a little bit of background about who we're talking about, what we're talking about, we're going to dive into discussion about barriers, disparities, equity, and inequity experienced by minority populations like the Latinx community. And since AAC system supports and services facilitate communication for people with disabilities, and since communication is a process that's embedded into almost all aspects of our daily lives, access to AAC is really important when it comes to equity. Without equitable access to AAC, people with disabilities experience barriers to and disparities in participation, independence, and autonomy. But what does it mean to have equitable access to AAC system supports and services? The image on this slide is used to differentiate between equality and equity. On the left, a baseball game is taking place. 3 people of varying heights are standing behind a wooden fence, which blocks their view of the game. Each of the 3 are given the same sized box to stand on, which for the tallest allows clear view of the game, but for the other 2 does not. The caption for this image states, "In the first image, it is assumed that everyone would benefit from the same supports. They are being treated equally." The second image on the right shows the same scenario, although each person is given the number of boxes that results in the same view of the baseball game. The tallest is not given any boxes, as this person can view the game without them. The second person is given one box, and the third is given two boxes. The caption under the image states, in this image, individuals are given different supports to make it possible for them to have equal access to the game. They're being treated equitably. If we apply this to AAC, equality would be a situation in which everyone gets the same AAC system, or possibly no one gets any AAC system at all. But regardless, they would be being treated the same. A situation, an equitable AAC situation, would be where everyone gets the system or systems that they need based on their skills, abilities, environment, and participation goals. Okay, this slide contains the same two images that we just described, but now there is a third. And this image challenges us to take the concept of equity a step further, by not only advocating for equitable access to AAC systems, supports, and services, but also by addressing environmental barriers to participation for communication impairments. Here, like I said, the first two images are the same as before with the three people watching the baseball games, but now the third image on the right, the wooden fence that was previously there is removed and it's been replaced with a see-through fence. The caption under this image states, all three can see the game without any supports or accommodations because the cause of the inequity or the barrier has been addressed. The first image was used to describe equality or illustrate equality, the second to illustrate equity. And this image, according to the source, is used to describe justice. But these comparisons are useful in understanding the experiences of people in the Latinx community who use AAC, because although there are disparities in accessing AAC for all people, even when somebody from the Latinx community with communication impairments obtains AAC, they experience unique barriers to using them compared to their mainstream peers. And these barriers serve to uniquely marginalize them. Now, the barriers and disparities experienced within this community are complex and multifaceted, like the layers of the onion pictured on this slide. They are many and they differ from person to person. But many of those experiences can be described or categorized or fall underneath barriers to AAC systems, supports, and services, or disparities and barriers to becoming or maintaining bilingualism. And we're going to talk a little bit more about each. On this slide, there's a black and white line drawing of a person in a wheelchair positioned at the bottom of a set of stairs. Attached to the hand railing for the stairs is a sign with an arrow pointing up the stairs, which says, "Weigh in, everyone is welcome." Unfortunately, we're really far away from equitable communication for all people with disabilities, regardless of race, ethnicity, culture, and language. But research shows that racial, ethnic, cultural, and linguistic minority groups experience unique barriers in accessing AAC that lead to disparate communication outcomes when compared to their mainstream counterparts. These barriers stem from difficulties in accessing disability-related services through large structures in our society. These are the same structures that serve as gatekeepers to AAC system supports and services. Two large systems of power that are relevant for AAC are healthcare and education. Hospitals and healthcare are relevant to AAC for many reasons, but just to give some examples and some context, primary care physicians are required to provide a prescription in order for insurance to cover the cost of any high-tech device. Also, sometimes AAC evaluations are obtained through speech therapists that work in hospitals or in outpatient settings. Similarly, AAC can be obtained through special education services in the school system, as can AAC device loans or trials, which are a required part of the evaluation process, and speech therapy that supports language learning through AAC. So inequity in accessing healthcare and education services therefore translates into equity in accessing AAC for people with disabilities. And research tells us that minority groups with disabilities, like the Latinx community, experience decreased access to healthcare in general, poor utilization of healthcare services, and poor quality of the services that they receive. Further, minorities are less likely to participate in special education, are less likely to be identified as having a communication disorder at all, and less likely to receive speech and language services, including AAC services, even when they've been identified with a communication impairment. It's not surprising then that research shows that minorities with disabilities are less likely to be aware of the help available in obtaining assistive technologies like AAC. They're more often to pay out of pocket for AT or AAC services, and they're less likely to apply for federally funded loans for assistive technology. Consequently, minority groups use fewer assistive devices, are less likely to have communication devices, and more likely to report unmet communication needs when compared to their mainstream counterparts. Now, the sources of these disparities and inequities are like the onion we saw earlier. They're multifaceted and complex, but many in part are related to language. This slide contains an image of 4 paper speech bubbles of different colors hanging from strings, each containing the different word for hello in varying languages like English, French, Spanish, and Mandarin Chinese. Not everyone in the Latinx community speaks a language other than English, but many do. And here in the US, many are either becoming bilingual or are already bilingual. What does it mean bilingual? Well, being bilingual means that you use more than one language to communicate, but any aspect of communication. So that includes either receiving and or sending your message. You do not need to have equal language abilities in both languages to be bilingual. In fact, you don't need to speak at all to be considered bilingual. If we think about people with communication impairments who use AAC who don't have speech, many of them rely on more than one language in their communication interactions, but they might not speak that language due to their communication impairment. So this is different than, I think, the traditional conceptualization of bilingualism, in which somebody must be proficient enough to even interpret or translate to be considered quote unquote truly bilingual. Why does bilingualism matter? Well, we know that communication facilitates participation, autonomy, and independence for people with disabilities. For people in bilingual contexts, the opportunity to learn and interact with others in both languages is critical for participation. The importance of bilingualism is illustrated by the image on this slide, which is a picture of a social gathering in which 8 to 10 people are seated around a table with a checkered tablecloth. They are outdoors with plates of food and drinks on the table. Everyone's smiling and laughing and looking at one of the people on the right side of the table who's presumably sharing a story or a joke. Assuming that this is a bilingual interaction, what would someone who is bilingual or who's denied the opportunity to access both languages, what would they miss out on? On this slide, there's an image with a gray circle with the following written in pink. Bilingualism, choice or necessity, question mark, surrounded by different colored words printed in different languages. So often in our society, we assume that bilingualism is something that we choose, it's elected. But this is very rarely the case. More often, bilingualism is a necessity to survive or to thrive. And this is true for many people in the Latinx community who have disabilities. Before we go further, I want to do a little bit of myth busting about language learning, disability, and bilingualism. Moving forward in our conversation, I want you to keep the following in mind. The following are truths about bilingualism that are often contrary to common belief. The first is that bilingualism is not harder than or more difficult than monolingualism. So learning or speaking two languages is not harder than speaking or learning one language. Learning more than one language not jeopardize the quality of which somebody learns that language. So just because you're learning two languages doesn't mean that you're going to learn each language at half the capacity than if you were learning just one. The next truth about bilingualism is that it does not hinder or impede development in any way. And finally, one of the most important is that people with disabilities, people with communication impairments, can and do become bilingual without any cost to their overall development. Okay, so the research behind these truths could be a whole nother webinar in and of itself, but I just want to kind of establish those as truths moving forward. Research shows, despite these truths, that people with disabilities are denied the opportunities and excluded from the rich linguistic experiences crucial to learning two languages. Okay, and on this slide, there's an image of a goldfish bowl with a group of goldfish all facing outward on the right-hand side, with a single goldfish on the left, alone facing the left. And it's used to represent the denial of the opportunity to become bilingual for people with disabilities and the exclusion that comes as a result. In order to learn any language, we need exposure to and the opportunity to engage in rich, meaningful linguistic interactions. For younger children, many of these interactions take place in school or at home. Denying or limiting access to these interactions in a given language in either of these environments serves as a barrier to bilingual language development. Research shows that children with disabilities have less access to bilingual supports and services than their non-disabled peers. For example, they are frequently assessed and instructed in English only, receive speech and language services in English only, and special educators have limited training in working with diverse populations. They report a lack of minority language instructional materials, including AAC. This means that students' home languages are not supported in schools despite this being best practice. It's not surprising then that professionals frequently advise parents to choose English for their children and to choose English only, even to the extent that families should avoid interactions with family members who do not speak English and forego family, cultural, community, and religious events conducted in any language other than English. And unfortunately, research tells us that this advice carries weight in terms of the decisions parents make about language exposure at home, although not for the reasons you might think. Some studies show that parents consider home languages to be valuable to their children, but view English proficiency as a prerequisite to disability-related services like special education and therapy, including AAC. And so they feel they have no choice but to cease their home language. In fact, one study found that families fear being blamed for their child's disability by professionals due to continued home language use. So for people who use AAC, this scenario sometimes plays out even further when students get English-only AAC systems. What are the consequences of these situations? If we think back to the goldfish in the bowl, this is another image that represents the consequences of denying the access to opportunities to become bilingual for that fish. The image has about 5 goldfish on the left-hand side, all kind of interacting with each other, with a single goldfish who's now green on the right-hand side, who's trying to join the rest of the fish, but there's a hand holding up in black its entrance. And this represents the consequences. If we think back to that social interaction where everybody's sitting around the table, assuming that that's a bilingual interaction, this image represents, being denied interacting in that scenario. And that's what happens oftentimes to people with disabilities who come from bilingual contexts. So we're going to move on a little bit now to strategies that you can use or you can advocate for to help members of the Latinx communities in regards to AT or in regards to AAC specifically. This is an image on this slide that it represents the HAT model, which stands for the Human Assistive Technology Activity model. And it's a model that's commonly accepted and used in assistive technology. So it's something that anybody working in AT should be familiar with. And it's useful in advocating for our people who come from a minority context, because this whole interaction between the human, the assistive technology, and the activity sits upon or is embedded within the square on the bottom, which represents the context. The point being that these things don't happen in a black hole, right? Assistive technology is used to help a person, an individual, within their environment to perform or engage in an activity. And that all takes place and is dependent on that person's context. So their physical context, their social context, their cultural and institutional context. And so this is something that I think is useful for us to move forward in our discussion, but it's also something that can be referenced to in advocacy efforts if you're working with an AT team in the school or in any other setting, something that they could be familiar with. And given that assistive technology is useful within a given context, research shows us it's practice that these services, AT and AAC, should be family-centered, because for kids and even for adults, the family is often, the epicenter of those interactions. So a family-centered approach is best practice in AAC, and incorporating families is linked to successful AAC implementation. Families are fundamental to learning language and therefore to AAC regardless of their background. Families' priorities, insights, and values must be incorporated into the AT and AAC process to increase the likelihood that the equipment recommended will fit the culture, strengths, and lives of families and will lead to successful AAC implementation. And the image on this slide represents the family. It's a compilation of 4 hands piled on top of each other, with the largest hand being on the bottom, presumably belonging to an adult, and the top two hands being the smallest, presumably belonging to a child and to an infant. So this is a strategy that you as a provider can utilize, or you as a family member, or you as a person with a disability can advocate for, Um, including families in the evaluation process, including families in the implementation process, so that the AT or the AAC device fits their needs and their lifestyle. Um, as we talked about earlier, language is a key piece to all of this. And unfortunately, within assistive technology and AAC specifically, there are very few bilingual providers. And while that would be an ideal scenario, there are still a lot of things that can be done to incorporate families language-wise, if the family doesn't speak English, or if English isn't their preferred language, even if the provider doesn't speak that same language. So these recommendations come from the American Speech Language and Hearing Association, and they include using interpreters, using cultural brokers, incorporating other family and peers who speak English, as well as the family's language, and for the provider to research the home language, becoming familiar with maybe some key phrases, as well as some common cultural beliefs. This next slide gives a description of some of the tools that you can use to linguistically incorporate families, linguistically and culturally. So they range from an interpreter who communicates spoken language to a translator who communicates written language, as well as cultural and linguistic brokers. And these are people who have knowledge not only or not just of the language, but also of what the cultural values and practices are of that particular family. And this is where you can get really specific for people in the Latinx community, because as we talked about earlier, people within the Latinx community vary greatly depending on the country that they come from, or the generation that they pertain to. And so cultural and linguistic brokers might have knowledge specific to the characteristics of that individual and their family. Access to interpreters and translators is a right. It's a right in a healthcare setting, and it's a right in an educational setting, from evaluations to IEP meetings. And one strategy that providers can use, and families can use from an advocacy standpoint, is knowing those rights. So there are quite a few legislative and ethical mandates that require culturally and linguistically equitable services for people with disabilities in both healthcare and educational settings. We didn't have enough time to go through them in detail in this webinar, but I do have those references depending on the person and what where they're at, whether a school or a healthcare setting, that I could provide. And so knowing your rights is really important. As a provider, knowing what you are ethically and legally bound to is really important. And as people with disabilities and their families or support systems, it's really important to be able to advocate and to make sure that you're getting what you need and what you're entitled to. So these suggestions are more for providers, but they're just some basic ideas about incorporating families and different cultures and values into whatever it is that you're doing, whether it be your classroom or your therapy room, but just some ideas about dual language books, stories that are culturally relevant. So many of the practices in the U.S., cultural practices, aren't relevant for other people from the Latinx community. Incorporating preferred or pertinent foods, pertinent heroes or icons, and celebrating holidays and traditions that are meaningful to that family. And key to this is taking the time to find out what is that person's values and priorities as well as their families. Because as I said, the Latinx community is very diverse. And so, people from, uh, Puerto Rico might celebrate different holidays than people from Mexico or different parts of South America. So taking the time is really important, and I know that it's not always something that is embedded or within our daily practices. Another important thing to know is that dual language AAC systems are available. They're available in low tech, mid tech, and high tech systems. They're not available in every language, but they are available in Spanish. And so knowing this and advocating for this for kids or people who are in bilingual contexts is really important. Although there are dual language systems that do exist, they are not perfect, and they unfortunately are developed based on mainstream language and culture. And so many of the messages pre-programmed into AAC systems are based on the values of mainstream culture. For example, independence versus interdependence. They may not be meaningful for any families, and so you might have to make adjustments, right? Again, this goes back to taking the time to find out what's important to families and to people with disabilities specifically, to understand what messages they might need. There's a little image on the right-hand side that represents the difference in context dependent, or the level of context that's required in communication based on different ethnic backgrounds. So some groups rely heavily on the context to infer communicative meaning, whereas other groups don't. And so you can see on that slide that people in the United States who ascribe to American values, vary in comparison to some other groups. And so there's a quote that I have that I'd like to share that's from a research study that kind of represents this idea. It's from a mother of a child who has an AAC device. And she said, "Why would she, the person who uses AAC, need to say these things? Anyone who is talking to her at home already knows all that information. So would a friend. Can't she say instead how she's feeling or what she wants?" So she's referring to a lot of the personal information, like biographical information, that's often included in AAC systems, like somebody's name or telephone number. Whereas this mom, wanted to know more about how her daughter is feeling and what her desires are. Just like the messages that are based on mainstream American culture or in AAC systems, the symbols that are frequently used also match mainstream American culture. And you can see in the picture on the right-hand side, there's a couple of these symbols that are often used. There are 3 people in these symbols, and all of them, just on a basic front, they're all white, which might not identify with some of the other people using AAC devices. Research has actually shown that these symbols that are used in AAC systems don't mean the same to people from other backgrounds and cultures. And so just like the messages, these symbols can also be changed and adjusted. And that's something that we should be doing as providers, something that we should be advocating for as family members and support networks for people who use AAC. And this last slide here just represents it's a well there on the screen here it doesn't seem to be there doesn't seem to be a circle, but there should be a circle connecting the different aspects of our lives, so home, school, work, friends, and community. And the image is used to represent the idea that we must be incorporating all relevant languages when working with someone who uses assistive technology and AAC specifically, so that they can participate in all of these environments, not just one. Thinking back to the HAT model, the human activity and assistive technology model, that model illustrates that the AT must match the person and the activity within a given context, not the other way around. And so that's the last idea that we're going to end on before we have the opportunity to answer any questions.
Thanks so much, Ellen, and sorry about that last slide. I think some of the pictures, for some reason, did not upload all the way, so thanks for improvising. We
Thanks. No
apologize
worries.
for that. So just as a friendly reminder, if anybody else wants to send in questions, you can do so through the chat box on the bottom. If you click on that pink button in the bottom right corner and then the little speech bubble icon, there's a place for you to type in questions. We do have some that were sent in, Ellen, so I'll read some of those and get started with this. So the first question is, where can families get informed about their rights related to AT and language access?
Sure. So I think I guess I'm not sure. I shouldn't make this assumption, but for people who are in Chicago or are in Illinois, I do have some specific resources. If there is anybody who's out of state, these might not be as helpful, and please let me know, and I can do a little bit more research depending on where you're from. But Equip for Equality is an organization that offers legal services within the school system, typically for families of people with disabilities. That's a great place to start. Another organization is the Family Resource Center on Disability in Chicago. That is another great resource. Both of those organizations have people who have personnel that speak languages other than English. And then also connecting with other families. At UIC, we have an organization called Grupo Salto that is specifically for children or people with autism who come from Spanish-speaking families, as well as their families and support networks. So that's SALTO, and they meet once a month at UIC. That's a great resource too.
Great, thanks. A second question we got was, for parents who are bilingual, speaking English and Spanish, in what language should they speak to their child who has autism spectrum disorder?
Well, as we talked about a little bit in the webinar, although we didn't have time to go into great detail, people with disabilities, including people with autism, do become bilingual, and there is no risk to their overall development in learning more than one language. That's just what the research is showing us at this point. And it's also as somebody who's worked in this community for quite some time, it's also been my experience. And so if for parents who are already bilingual, they should speak to their children in whatever language is most natural to them, given the context. So, it's very natural for people who are bilingual to switch between one language to another. That's okay. That's how we communicate naturally, and that's the best form of input that you can get, a natural input that you can give somebody who's learning more than one language.
All right, and I have one last question that was sent in. What additional advice or information do you have for providers who speak a language other than English and want to provide bilingual services to people with disabilities?
Providers who speak a language other than English and want to provide services. Oh, so I think that this question is in reference to people who are in school still, who are becoming providers, but they grew up speaking a language other than English, and they want to incorporate this into their profession. My advice or information is yay, and is to encourage them, to continue to pursue, their profession in providing disability-related services, because we really need bilingual service providers across the board. And so I guess my first piece of advice is to keep going. And then my last piece of advice is to depending on what their profession is, you do some research to see if there are any certifications or certificates that they can incorporate into their training to become a certified bilingual service provider. Because depending on the profession, for example, special education, speech language pathology, there are training opportunities to strengthen your knowledge to become a bilingual provider, and not just somebody who's a provider who happens to speak another language. So my advice is to do some research with your professional organization or your graduate program to see if there are any additional training opportunities available to strengthen your clinical services for that particular population.
Okay, thank you so much, Ellen, for answering those questions and for a wonderful presentation. That's everything we've gotten in terms of questions right now. If anyone else has questions and wants to follow up with Ellen, her contact information is on the slide, the current slide. You can also access the slide handouts on the registration webpage if you want to go back and find that information as well. Just to finish up, we still have more webinars coming for you in this series. Next Thursday on May 16th, we have a session called AT Creating Individualized Communication Profiles that you can still register for at the link provided. So we would encourage you to do so. Thank you everybody for joining, and thank you, Ellen, for your presentation.
It was my pleasure. Thank you, guys.